All right.
Yeah.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for coming to RJ Julia. Thank you for coming to this event. I would love to see the store full of excited readers, even despite the elements out there that were trying to discourage us. But I'm Michael, event host with RJ Julia. Our special guest tonight is best-selling author Joyce Maynard, here to tell us about her new book, The Bird Hotel, among other things, I expect. We want to make sure everyone's comfortable and can see and hear everything. So if you need anything, if you have any issues, just raise your hand. I'm Michael, and Jackie's here to assist also. When Joyce is speaking, hopefully the microphone will carry to the back also.
Let me know if there's any issue.
Yeah. After a brief introduction, we'll turn the time to Joyce. We'll have some time for questions from the audience also, and then immediately after we're done in here, we'll come back into the other room near the entrance, and Joyce will be signing books. So I say a brief introduction, but sometimes you meet or learn about a person whose life and work can't just be compressed into like a few short sentences, but I'll still keep it to just a minute or two. Joyce Maynard has been a reporter and columnist for the New York Times, regular contributor to NPR and several national magazines, a syndicated newspaper columnist whose column appeared in over 50 newspapers nationwide. He's published hundreds, which caught my eye, hundreds of essays, as well as 18 books, both fiction and nonfiction, including a memoir and the novels To Die For and Labor Day, both adapted for film. Her novel, Count the Ways, who I heard a few people mentioning as they were even coming in, recently was awarded. Hey, thanks for coming.
Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. You didn't even miss any of the good part. Just
There's a spot
just-
right there.
so there.
Okay.
Also, all right. Yeah, so her novel Count the Ways was recently awarded the Grand Prix Literary Prize in France. Joyce is also a longtime performer with the Moth, a native of New Hampshire. But I always look at the author sometimes to like see if I got it wrong. But yeah, native of New Hampshire, Joyce's recent travels have included visits to some familiar locations around England. Also looked like you were in Italy recently, or
I get around.
yeah. Yes. Additionally, every winter, Maynard leads the Lake Atitlan Memoir Workshop right by the lake in Guatemala. Hopefully you'll tell us a little bit more about that also. Essentially. The Bird Hotel is the new book. Bird Hotel tells the story of a talented young American artist who, after suffering tragedy, restores and runs a beautiful, decaying lakefront hotel at the base of a volcano in Central America. We meet a rich assortment of characters who live in the village or come to stay at the hotel. Bird Hotel holds a mystery at its center. It's filled with warmth, drama, romance, humor, pop culture, and even some magical elements. Now we'll hear from Joyce Maynard.
This is one of my favorite bookstores to come. I'm thrilled to be with you. And I'm thrilled to share this book. I'm going to begin by telling you a little bit about how it got to be written, because it's a very, I've published quite a few books at this point, but this was a unique writing experience. So I'll tell you a little bit about that. For the last 27 years, I've had a home on the shores of a very beautiful lake in Guatemala, Lake Atitlan, Guatemala. And originally I envisioned my little adobe house on the shores of this very beautiful lake, looking out at 5 volcanoes, as my getaway place to write, quietly write, and be by myself. But it was such a great place to write that I decided to start a memoir workshop so that other people could write there too. And I have to say, it's only for women. I did discover that women behave very differently when men aren't around. So we had men for a few years and they were great men. I love these men, but really it was for women. So I've been hosting this memoir workshop for quite a few years, 20 some years. And I would always put people up at a little kind of funky little hotel in the village near my home. And my home was kind of funky, but beautiful, and had gardens and birds. And in March of 2020, I don't need to say too much more than March of 2020, I went down there, as I did every year, to welcome my writing students. And I didn't know if anybody would show up. Nobody knew what was really going on at that point. But I figured in case somebody does, I want to be there because I knew that there were women who waited years to come down, and I wanted to be there for them to help them tell their story. Something that's very important to me in particular because I published a book one time that people told me I didn't have any right to publish. I told a story that turned out to be a forbidden story. So I don't believe that any of our stories should be forbidden stories, which is why I go down to Guatemala. So I was there in March of 2020, waiting to see if anybody would show up. And amazingly, 16 women came to Guatemala. There were no reported cases of COVID at that point, but we knew things were going strange. And 2 days after the women arrived in Guatemala, the president of Guatemala got on the TV and said, we are closing the airport in 2 more days. So if you want to get home, better leave now. And 8 of the women did leave. They had to leave, and I understood that, as did our chef, which was a bit of a problem. But the amazing thing was that the other 8 stayed and decided, no, they're going to be here and tell their stories, and we'll figure it out. And we kind of hunkered down because we didn't want to create any problems in that village. So we made do, and I hired a group of Indigenous women to cook significantly less fancy food than we were going to eat. A lot of rice, beans, vegetables, guacamole. And we had this spectacular 12 days, because it went on and on, because there were no planes, of sharing our stories. And I kind of knew that the United States State Department was not going to leave these women in the lurch. And sure enough, they sent a plane down. It was kind of like Casablanca, you couldn't go into the airport, but people were standing on the tarmac to get on the plane. I didn't go back. I knew that I was in the absolute best place to spend a pandemic. And I invited 2 of my writing students, the 2 youngest, who were both 32 years old. Incidentally, I have one of my writing students here tonight, who has been in Guatemala and swum in that lake. So thank you, Sarah, for being here. So I invited Shiren and Jenny to stay with me, thinking we'd be together for 3 weeks, 4 weeks maybe. We weren't stuck. We could have gone home, but we stayed for 6 months. And I have to say they were 6 of the most magical months of my life. I had a very good man back home waiting for me, but frankly, I was doing just fine writing and being with the girls, I call them. And FaceTiming him, he's here tonight also, lives in Madison. So this is a hometown event for me. So every day after all the other writers left, we did our projects, and mine was finishing my novel, Count the Waves. I had a little writing cabinet at the top of the property, and I climbed the hill every day with my laptop and my coffee at about 6:45 a.m. and get to work on Count the Waves. And every night I would come down to the house and meet up with the girls. One of them, Shiren, was a composer, and she didn't have a piano, but she was recording bird songs and figuring out how to make music out of them. And Jenny was making a podcast about immigration issues. And we would gather at the house at the end of the day. Everything was dead quiet. There were no boats on the lake, no people walking around. Everybody had left. There was just the lake, the volcano, and us. I happened to have, and this is a little bit odd, but I had a closet full of very fancy evening gowns. And the reason I had these fancy evening gowns is that evidently stores like Neiman Marcus that have merchandise they don't sell, but they don't want anybody to see that it's still out there, ship it to Guatemala. And I go to the markets, and for $2, I get to buy these Neiman Marcus evening gowns. So I have quite a few of them that I really didn't have any particular occasion to wear, but I loved the evening gowns. So every night we would put on our gowns, and a fisherman would paddle up to the dock with a fish, and we would cook this Shiren that came from China, and she had all these wonderful Asian ways of cooking fish, and we would light candles, and have our marvelous meal in our evening gowns. And afterwards, I would read out loud to the girls from the chapter that I'd written that day of my novel, Count the Waves, under the stars, looking out at the volcano. It was pretty great. The only problem was that I finished the book. And we were still there, and we didn't really want to not be there yet. So they said, well, start another book. And this is it, The Bird Hotel. And I mention that because I really wrote it for the girls, Jenny and Shiren. And it was a kind of bedtime story for them. If you read the book, you know, I think there's exactly 100 chapters. And every night I would read them a chapter from The Bird Hotel. And every morning they'd shoo me up the hill again and say, go back, write some more. We want to know what happens next. And I didn't know what happened next myself. It really was, I thought of myself as like Shahrazad in the Arabian Nights, that I was entertaining us all with the stories of this fantastical place that does bear a certain strong resemblance to my home in Guatemala.
Yeah.
But I never call it Guatemala. I made up a Central American country. And I'm going to read you just the first page and a half, because really what I like to do much more is have a conversation. I'm hoping we'll get to have one. But this is how the book begins. And most of it is set in this unnamed Central American country, but it begins in the USA with a woman named Irene. I was 27 years old when I decided to jump off the Golden Gate Bridge. One afternoon, I had this great life. Half an hour later, all I wanted was to be dead. I took a taxi. It was just after sunset when I reached the bridge, rising up through the mist, that wonderful shade of red I had loved back when I still cared about the colors of things and bridges and getting to the other side of them. Back when I cared about so many things that now seemed meaningless. Before leaving my apartment that last time, I'd stuffed a $100 bill in my pocket. I gave this to the driver. Why wait for change? There were tourists, of course, traffic heading in and out of the city, parents with children in strollers. I used to be one of those. A boat was passing under the bridge. From where I stood, preparing to jump, I watched it make its way under the pilings, men mopping the deck. Nothing made sense anymore. I'd been dimly aware of an elderly man watching me. He might try to stop me, so I waited for him to move on, and after a few minutes, he did. Only I couldn't take that last step up onto the railing over the edge. One thing about hard times, Lenny had said once, when our rent check bounced the same week Arlo got sent home from daycare with head lice, and I came down with mono, and a pipe burst in our apartment that destroyed a stack of drawings I'd been working on for 6 months. Once you hit bottom, things can only get better. Standing on the bridge, looking down at the dark and swirling water, I think I recognized something about myself. Even though the place in which I now found myself was terrible, some small part of me couldn't let go of the world. The fact of grieving a vast loss, as I did, had to serve as some kind of reminder that life was precious, even mine, even then. I stepped away from the ring. I couldn't do it, but I couldn't ever go home again either. I had no home anymore. This is how I ended up at the Bird Hotel. So our character's name is Irene, and she's in her early 30s when the story begins. Actually, the story begins in her childhood. She's had a pretty rough loss in her childhood as well, and another very big loss that has recently occurred that sends her off to the bridge that day. And I'm not going to tell you what that is, of course. And she doesn't really care if she lives or dies. She gets on a bus. I lived for a number of years near San Francisco, and there was a company called the Green Tortoise. It was an old hippie bus. Somebody's nodding. And they had no seats, just mattresses and probably a whole lot of pot and maybe a good sound system in the bus. I don't know. But they would just head for somewhere south. And so our girl, Irene, gets on this bus, not with any particular care of where she's going to end up. And where she ends up is this little village. She comes, the last leg of her journey is on a boat, as mine is when I go to Guatemala, to Lake Atitlán. And a little boy meets her at the dock and picks up her suitcases and says, I know where you should go, and takes her to a hotel run by an old American expat woman, a woman from Nebraska, who's lived there for about 35 years. There are no guests at this hotel. It's called La Llorona, which means the weeping woman. And she checks in. So I don't even think I'll read about that. I think we're just going to talk. So she lands at this hotel, really with believing that her life is over. And for reasons that I won't explain, she's going to end up running the hotel. And it is in the process of running this hotel, fixing the hotel is horribly run down. It's basically a mess. And she thinks she's just going to fix it up enough to sell it. But she stays, and people come, people go. It actually was so much fun making up these chapters, because anytime I got tired of one story, actually I never got tired of a story, but just a new person would check into the hotel. And over the course of the years at the hotel, she makes a new life for herself. An interesting thing often happens to me when I'm writing a book, and after I've written a book, I don't realize until I finish the book where I am in the story. This was meant to be a work of total invention, a kind of fairy tale for Jenny and Shiren, that I would read them every night. But afterwards, I realized, oh, right, I've been a woman who's felt kind of wiped out in her life too, and had to reimagine a new way to live. And in fact, the first time that ever happened to me was when I was 20 years old, and I thought my life was over. Heartbreak, of course. And I ended up in Mexico and was invited on an orchid hunt in Guatemala. I always have spoken to them as an old couple. They were probably younger than I am now, but they were an old couple to me then. And they invited me on this orchid hunt, and I saw Lake Atitlán, Guatemala for the first time in 1973 as a twin, and fell in love with it then. So in fact, this is a book about resilience and surviving hard loss, two themes of my own life that I'm quite well acquainted with. It's also my homage, really, to an indigenous culture very dear to me. And I'll say here that, and I won't spend a lot of our valuable time talking about this, but this book actually has had a very challenging trajectory. I've published many books, and they've always been published with mainstream publishers. And when I finished this book, I was really proud of it and excited, and discovered that nobody would publish it. And I say this as a person who's an absolute supporter of the importance, the essential nature of having diverse voices in the arts and in literature and in the sciences and in all avenues of our lives. But at the same time, it was a harsh discovery that I, as a white writer who did not have a Latina heritage, was told I could no longer situate a book in Central America. Even a book written from the point of view of a North American person, it does not appropriate the voice of a Latina or an indigenous person. But The book was turned down by every mainstream publisher to whom it was sent, and it was sent to many. So it ended up being published by a very small publisher, and who couldn't do too much about supporting it. So it's a real word of mouth book, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so happy all of you are here, because if you read it and you like it, maybe your mouths will get to work also in this book. It's a story that honors. It was so strange to me to be told that I could not tell this story. I never pretend to be a person of Latina or Indigenous heritage, but my 20-some years, almost 30 years of living part-time in Guatemala have instructed me greatly in the beauty of a culture so different from ours and from which we have much to learn. So the book is populated by foreigners, expats, a few crooks, a few really bad guys, guests at the hotel, and the people who work in the village, who I was inspired by the people who work with me. And I always say with me, not for me, in Guatemala for my retreats. I'm going to tell you just one other story before I really hope I get to hear from you. And it is this. So I was writing this book, I was reading the chapters every night. There was only one problem really, and it wasn't COVID. And it wasn't any sense of isolation. It was wonderful having things be so quiet and so still. And I say that recognizing how hard life was for so many others. But for me, it was, and for the two young women I was living with, it was really extraordinarily rich and inspiring time. We taught one of them how to swim. We made these great meals, we got our evening gowns, and we had our work. But there was a big problem. And it wasn't COVID, it was unemployment. Because the little village where my house sits and where I have hosted my workshops for years depended hugely on tourists. It's a kind of hybrid of very traditional Mayan indigenous culture and people from all over the world who come there. It's kind of got a reputation as a sort of healing village, and all the people who came for their healing were gone, and nobody had a job. And some members of the Gringo community who were left, many people left, most people left, went round collecting money to buy beans and rice for people in the village. And of course I contributed, but I also had a sense this is not the answer. So I decided I would create jobs. And I thought, I'm going to build a little house on this property. I have a big house. I'm going to build a little guest house. So I hired 20 men, as one can afford to do in a small indigenous village and still pay them well. Something I probably could not do in Madison, Connecticut. And then I hired them to build me a house. No need for building permits. I just made a sketch of what I wanted. I said, I want these stones, and I want these vines, and I want this coffee wood to be a railing for the balcony, and I want this avocado wood to be a desk, and I want this stick style to be the bedspread. And so every day, as I climbed the hill up to my little writing cabin to write, I've never felt such a direct relationship between the work I do and what it can bring about. 20 men came down the hill with their picks and their shovels, all hand tools, mixing cement, digging holes, putting in rebar, and building my little casita. And they were so happy to have jobs. Only problem? The casita was finished and the pandemic was still on. Solution? I built another casita. And in the end, I built 6 casitas, a yoga platform, a sauna, a waterfall, a second dock. And I hadn't really thought this through because I'd spent every penny I had doing this, even in Guatemala. And I suddenly realized, oh, I only give a workshop like 2 weeks a year. What am I going to do with all these casitas? So I run a hotel. I actually do run a bird hotel in Guatemala. And I have to say, and I'm not trying to sell you, I'm going to Casa Paloma retreat, but because it's actually full most of the time. I think there are 20 people booked there tonight, and a payroll of about 35 men and women, all from that village, who continue to work there, which among other things means they have made the decision not to make the very dangerous and lonely journey to the border to get paid less than minimum wage in the United States. And they work with me. So that's, I hope I can talk forever, but really what I love is to hear from you. So please be free with your questions about this book, about other books of mine. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the publication of my first book, so there have been a few out there, and I'm always happy to talk about those. Count the Ways. I'm actually just at all day today until I came here. I was working on the very last revisions of the sequel to Count the Ways. It's going to come out next year. But fire away. There's no such thing as a bad question. Yes, what's your name?
Patrick,
Patrick, hi.
my young son here is teaching in an American school in Guatemala.
I noticed him right away because he's the youngest person here. No offense to everybody else, but I'm always thinking, whoa, got a young one.
He had been asking us, we talked for 3 years, he's been asking us, please come down and visit, and we put it off for the State Department. They told us that.
You believe that?
Yes, we heard it here. So we'll steal it. And they suggested that if you do go, they leave some DNA. I thought, thank you, by the way. What you leave, what in the bag is.
Nobody said that, but it's terrible. Yeah.
So we ended up going down.
I don't even know how you do leave DNA.
Right. You don't want to hear my And we had talking about people. We just absolutely loved it. I thought it was, we were looking for Metropolis beyond that, and no, people was a digger.
Yeah.
And then we then took to Lake Teapot. And that's when I first had my real mixed feelings about it. Is so beautiful. And my first thought was not only beautiful, but the U.S. Coast Guard never approved this ferry.
No.
I'm going back to Portsmouth, finally just being in this country that is so different.
Yes.
And
And that's the big lesson of it, and it's actually one of the reasons why I host memoir workshops there. I love what happens when you take a person out of their comfort zone. I actually put them in a pretty comfortable zone, but a different zone. And it shakes you up. And things that you thought were just how life is, were just how life is for us here, right?
We felt so safe there,
Yes.
safer than in this country.
Well,
And people are.
I do too. And I'm delighted that you mentioned this because to this day, and as I said, this book is not, I never identify the country very deliberately in this book as Guatemala. And it has lots of inventions that are not Guatemala, but definitely that was my inspiration. And but the U.S. State Department has had a warning about North Americans, I would say North Americans, Guatemalans are Americans too, traveling to Guatemala specifically. To this day, it's a very political warning. You could just as easily warn people not to come to the United States, right? Places that we have, obviously. But I'm here to tell you, I have probably at this point hosted about 1,000 people at my home as guests and about 500 writers in their stories. Haven't lost a one yet. Some of them don't want to go home. That's a different kind of issue. I actually have 2 of my students here. Yes. What's your name?
I'm Helen.
Hi.
Hi, I'm following you on Facebook and I have a comment on occasion to some of your comments. Question? Yes.
Are you sure? Yeah, you can stand up. And I'll repeat the question too.
Not necessarily a question, but I was at my local library and I wanted to pick out one of your novels. I had read your memoir by your late husband, but I wanted to read some fiction. And I didn't know which one to choose. There were so many. And so I wound up choosing Count the Ways. And then when I read that you were planning to do you were doing a sequel, I thought, oh my God, how serendipitous was that? So I'm really enjoying this book.
Count the Ways came out a couple of years ago, and I took a full year thinking about what I wasn't intending to write a sequel to Count the Ways, but I heard from so many readers who said, what happens next to this woman? and I had sort of left her in the middle of a number of things. So I take that very seriously. My characters become very dear to me, even the ones who are a little problematic and do some things that aren't so great. I really love them, and I spend my day with them. It's an odd way to spend your day alone in a room day after day with these people who you could say don't exist. So it was very important to me to think about to giving Eleanor a great next chapter. Of course, she has to have problems. I can't just make everything be good. That won't be interesting. So there will be some problems, but she's also going to have a really great love affair, and some other things will happen.
But the one other thing, when you're talking about how you turned this book kind of into a bedtime story for your guests. And I was telling Mary here that I had written a play, and I was part of a readers theater group at my library, and I was reading parts of it at each of our meetings, and they said, "And what happens next?"
Yeah.
And it was because of them that I finished it.
It's the best thing. There are writers who will say exactly the opposite to this. I never know what's going to happen next. Part of the reason why I think I take so much joy in getting out of bed every morning and racing to my laptop is that I can't wait to see what's going to happen. I know who my characters are, so I know the kind of people they are, I know the kind of trouble they would get into, and what their obsessions and their frailties are, and their strengths. But frailties tend to be more interesting in a novel. But I honestly do not know. For anybody who's read my novel Labor Day, for instance, I was 15 pages away from the end of Labor Day, and there's a man who's an escaped convict, and there's a lonely single mother who's hiding him out in her house, and there's her 13-year-old son who's watching these two people fall in love, and there's the police getting closer and closer to come and get him and take him back to prison, and they're in love, and he's a good guy, and she has finally found a good person to be with, and the sirens are going. What on earth is going to happen? No idea until my characters really tell me, as they do again and again. It was true in the Bird Hotel as well. It's what gets me to work every day. Yes, what's your name?
My name's Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
Hearing your process there reminded me of the writing workshop I've taken. They talk about plotters and pantsers. Have you ever heard that before?
I have not.
So according to them, you would be someone who lives by the seat of their pants.
Yes,
So you're a pantser, not a plotter.
I can't really, and there are, wonderful writers who, John Irving
That's
always,
exactly
always
what I
says he knows the
Right.
last line of a novel before he writes the first. What I know is who the people are. And that will lead me, as is true with our children. We don't know what our children are going to do, but we know who they are. And their lives unfold based on who they are. And that's true in my books as well. And sometimes I actually weep. It sounds crazy, a character doesn't have to die, but it feels like, yeah, he's gonna die. I guess he's gonna die. Yes.
Hi, I'm Mary.
Hi.
So does Joyce ever override her character's will, and then you have to back up from that?
Oh, good question, Mary. No, I can't. I'm not God to my characters. My characters take on a life of their own. It's funny. The image that I always had, there are people in this audience old enough to remember the old Pinocchio movie, or the old Disney film, where Geppetto makes this wooden puppet, and he's just a puppet. He's just a wooden puppet. But all of a sudden, kind of like what happens with our children, we make these little puppet people, and we think for about 10 minutes that we'll be in charge of their lives. And then Pinocchio has ideas of his own, and that's really how it is for me. It's very much how it is for me. So there's a kind of excitement that I feel writing. Oh boy! And I certainly felt it writing the sequel to Count the Ways, and I certainly felt it with this. Yeah. Yes. What's your name?
Sarah.
Sarah. Also Sarah.
It's a theme.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Well, there is no pattern. I'll tell you, Irene. I mean, she's a woman who she's actually a little bit younger than me, probably born in the 60s, of a kind of hippie mother. Who, and so I bring in obsessions of mine, like, you know, I loved folk music. I was listening to Joan Baez. So she names her daughter Joan. And then I'm sort of thinking about this hippie mother, you know, the dad is gone, they're kind of living, you know, hand to mouth. And she gets involved with a group of anti-war activists. We're talking the 60s, the late 60s now. She's on a pilgrimage to Woodstock, and with her daughter, who is this Joan character. And she meets some guys who say that they've got a house in, I originally had it Greenwich Village because that was the real one, but I changed it to uptown in Manhattan. They are making bombs in this house, and she gets involved with some very bad stuff, and people are killed. And she's gone, the mother is gone, and the daughter, Joan, is left with her grandmother at the age of 7. Where did that come from? Well, my interest in folk music, my interest in American history, current American history, or recent American history. I remember that event when a bunch of very misguided young anti-war activists exploded a bomb and a lot of people were killed in Greenwich Village. And so I take bits of the truth, and I think, and I often think about like who the side characters are in the big stories. You know, we know about the main players, but what about the daughter of one of the main players? So she has to change her name to Irene because they have to disappear and they go on the lam, and she's raised by her grandmother. And then I'm off to the races. And then she's got this absent mother and this secret that she can never tell. Well, that comes from me. That's a theme of my life because I grew up with a number of secrets in her family, as families often have. Mine was the secret of my father's alcoholism that we could never speak of. And later I had the secret of the young relationship I made when I was 18 with a very famous man that I must never speak of, I was told, and abided by that for 25 years, and then didn't, and got into a whole bunch of trouble when I didn't. So it's a combination, Sarah, of things I know and things I don't know, but I want to imagine. And I give them the music that I've listened to and some of the foods that I cook and some things I would never cook and some places I would never go. And people who know me very well can spot little crumbs of my life, but they're mixed in with things that didn't happen. I write both memoir and fiction, and there's actually they're both about storytelling, and I hold myself to just as high a standard for good storytelling if I'm telling a memoir as I do a novel. But the difference is I already know what happened when I'm telling memoir. When I'm writing fiction, I get to go to places I've never been. And I love it. I feel very, very lucky to have been able to do this for 50 years, more than 50 years, actually. Yes, Bill, my neighbor. Until quite recently, I lived in New Haven, just around the corner.
So I met you as a reader when they published your first big magazine story.
In 1972?
1972,
Wow.
because we're exactly
Exactly the same
age.
age. I will be 70 in November.
And I was telling my friend that I remember so vividly the cover and the article. And
I completely missed the irony. The title of the article was "An 18-year-old looks back on life."
I followed and read so many of your books and articles, and recently discovered, all your Facebook posts, which are beautiful essays. I don't think there's anyone who writes on Facebook.
There is one person, and that's my sister.
Yes.
So,
Rona Maynard, check her out.
and
She does the same thing.
it's
We
wonderful.
are the 2 graduates of the Friedel Bruiser Maynard School of Writing, which shut down when we left home, but my mother was the most wonderful teacher at writing.
So I'm sure I'm not the only one who lives vicariously on the number of adventures.
Yes.
And particularly this last one in France, which I wonder if you would talk about, especially the story concerning where you lived.
Sure. So I will say that I mean, I'm not complaining. Anybody who gets to continue to publish their work, for 50 years is doing well. Most of them are dead now, the ones who were publishing books in 1973. It's Joyce Carol Oates and me, we're the ones that are left. But I've had a kind of problematic career in the United States because I've always been associated with that man. I won't play around. This was Salinger. There'll be people who would say forever, she's the one who slept with Salinger, as if that's my one accomplishment in life 50 years ago. But in France, I have a completely different kind of career, along with Woody Allen and Jerry Lewis. I love Jim France. And people don't understand what the big deal is about Salinger. They just like me. And so that's very refreshing. And so I get invited to France a lot. And I was, normally I go on a book tour, but this summer I made good on a promise that I made to myself for a very long time that I was going to study French in a really, okay, I'm going to tell you this story. So I was at a literary festival in Paris last fall. And I was on a panel with a very famous American writer, whose name I'm not going to say, but his books are definitely here, and they probably have prizes on them. And I would not be on such a panel in the United States. I wouldn't be thought worthy of being on a panel with this great American male writer, but I was, because it was Paris. So I'm on the stage with him and three other men, and everybody else has a translator, and I'm proud to say I did not, because I've been working really hard on my French. I feel if the French are going to love me, I'm going to speak French. So I was there without my translator, and a question was asked of the great American writer about something to do with his book and his characters, and he held forth for some time. And then they asked the other man, and he held forth, and then they asked me a question about my character in Count the Waves. This was the novel Count the Waves, which is called Où vivent les gens heureux in French, where the happy people live. And I said something in French that would have been that different if I'd been speaking English, probably a little more complex, but I just said, this woman has had many hard times, but she, over the course of her lifetime, she learns many things, and she acquires she understands forgiveness. And I say this in French, and so then my French is translated kind of humorously to my fellow Americans into English, at which point the great American writer says, well, I am a literary writer. I do not write self-help fiction. And he says it in English, and then it's translated into French, and you could see this wave, because they really were on my side here, and you could see this wave of and so I answered him in French, and I said, I was about to say his name, about, I don't fault you for this misconception. Perhaps you haven't read my books, although I have read yours. I don't really think of my books as self-help, but I think that any good, serious work of fiction, we see characters grow and change. It's sort of the nature of a good story. And he had nothing more to say. It was translated for him in English and conscious. But the good part is, after this event, I decided he should have a copy of Count the Waves in English, of course. Clearly, he didn't speak French. So I run over to the tent where they're selling books, and there was, I'm sure some of you know the great store Shakespeare and Company. So there was the Shakespeare and Company, and the woman who was the owner, daughter of the guy who founded it, was just packing up. And I said, oh, could I buy a copy of Count the Waves? I didn't even explain why, but I did say to her, Shakespeare and Company has had this tradition of posting very young people who will come and just sleep on couches upstairs in the bookstore and work in the store. And they've been doing this for like 60 years since her father was running. I said, when I was young, it was always my dream to stay at Shakespeare and Company and just write and study French. And she said, oh, I've got an apartment for you then. So I was given an apartment for a month, thanks to Oh, it really is hard not to say that name, but I'm not going to. And I really should thank him. So I had this apartment in Paris. I was writing in Paris every afternoon. I studied French and I went and saw friends and met with readers. I decided to throw a party in Paris, but I didn't. My apartment wasn't really big enough to throw a party. So I just said, I'm going to be in the Tuileries Garden at such and such a time on a Sunday afternoon. I'll be bringing cheese and bread if you'd like to join me too. So about 35 people did. So yes, that was Paris. And they gave me, who's been to Shakespeare and Company? It's the most fabulous bookstore ever. And no, how can I say that here? But it's a great bookstore and a very quirky bookstore. And there are now lines of people outside Shakespeare and Company. You wait about an hour to get in. But I had the key. So I could go in the middle of the night all by myself. Imagine getting to come into RJ Julia at 1 a.m. and just darting around the shelves and picking out bookmarks and whatever.
We'll do one more question.
Yeah, please. Yes, yes.
So with the sequel to Count the Waste, you're not gonna have any trouble publishing, correct?
No, that'll be back to the other publisher.
That's
It
what I
was
thought.
just because I'm allowed to tell those stories.
That's pretty.
And I tell this story because I think it's important for readers to hear this. And I don't actually believe that it is an issue with readers, that readers aren't open-minded. You can, this story is full of lots of books you do not like, and you can buy writers you do not admire. You just don't have to buy them. But for the gatekeepers of publishing to decide what writers which stories writers can and cannot tell is to me deeply disturbing. And so I urge you, and it was definitely, libraries weren't buying this book because it wasn't like a regular, on the circuit kind of a thing. But it's been very gratifying to see that even in these times of social media and everything else, that it is possible for a book to have a kind of grassroots growing process, which this one has had. So I'm really happy to sign your books. I think they have Count the Ways here too. If you haven't read Count the Ways, you want to be up to speed for that sequel, which is called How the Light Gets In, and will come out next summer. And even if you're not buying a book, by all means, come and just say hello. I really love that. I also will just tell you that while I was in Paris, I don't know if you've ever seen this, I bought this very French thing that embosses a book with like your name raised. So you will have the only like Joyce Maynard stamped book with a drawing of mine that's like comes out raised. I'll still sign it, but it's really fancy. It's really, and it's very French.